All right. Hello again, everybody. We're back for lesson 3 of chapter 6, dealing with changes and reforms in Kansas. Another type of reform was in the way of political parties, including populism or the Populist Party. So today we're going to be getting into that. So last lesson, we talked about suffrage and prohibition reforms. Not just women and people against alcohol were wanting change, others wanted change too. And this included industrial laborers and farmers wanted change. Populism got its start in the 1880s and the 1890s because crop prices were very low. And this was causing more farmers to go into debt because with low prices on their crops, they weren't making much and they couldn't pay off their debts and they were losing their land. But farmers organized the Farmers Alliance to gain more control over supplies and prices. It didn't really solve a whole lot because the change would have to come through politics. But they created what was called the People's Party or the Populist Party, and this is what helped change the state and national politics. Populism was just a national movement that was associated with farmers and laborers trying to solve the unequal distribution of wealth in the U.S., trying to give everyone a chance to live the American dream. In God we trusted, in Kansas we busted. This was a saying that kind of was making the rounds in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was really difficult for farmers to make a good living in Kansas. New technology in farming, it was able to cut time and labor costs for farmers, and they could plant a lot more acres. However, they had to buy the new expensive machinery to do so. When they bought the expensive machinery, it put them in debt, and it caused them to create a surplus when they were creating more crops than they needed, and they were able to sell those extra crops. It wasn't just one farmer doing that, it was all of them, which created a surplus all around, and it made those prices go down. So it was a good thing to have all the technology, but then it also had some negatives when it made the prices go down in the long run. Kansas also had a lot of droughts at that time that made growing crops nearly impossible. Imagine like a really dry Kansas summer. They had multiple summers of that. A bad year and too much debt would mean that farmers a lot of times would lose their farm. Over 11,000 Kansas farms faced foreclosure, which is where a lender, often a bank, takes back property because the person has failed to make a payment on it. Many people ended up leaving Kansas because of this. They came here for the opportunities. The opportunities weren't panning out, so they ended up leaving. But the People's Party, the Populist Party, the platform for them, they were wondering who should the government represent, the workers or big business? They were wanting the workers. Populists also believed that the railroads were favored over workers for several reasons. They were given too much money to transport crops, and bank interest rates were way too high. If people were taking out loans, they were paying a lot of interest when they were making their payments back. Some more of the platform. They wanted to change the way the U.S. mints money and distributed money. They wanted to break up the monopolies and the trusts so that so the prices were subject to competition. They wanted to create an income tax where rich paid a higher percentage of their earnings than the poor. They wanted to limit government revenue so it didn't exceed the government spending. So they didn't want the government to spend as much money so the government wouldn't go into debt. They wanted to give the government ownership of the railroads, telegraph, and telephone. That way, individuals weren't having a monopoly on those things and making a ton of money. They wanted to prevent land speculation and ownership of land by people who aren't citizens. That would cut out all the immigrants who are trying to make a profit off of land. And they also wanted to reform elections through the use of a secret ballot, where the election of U.S. senators were by the people, and it allowed people to initiate the laws, and it also allowed people to recall elected officials. This was part of the platform that actually is still around today. We're able to elect our own U.S. senators. We use secret ballot, and the people can elect or can recall elected officials if they're not doing their job and not doing what they're supposed to. Some of the uh, well-known populists in Kansas. In the 1890 election, the Populist Party did really, really well because they were representing the people, and the people voted for them. They elected 92 legislators, gaining control of the Kansas House of Representatives. So 5 out of the 7 U.S. congressional seats went to the Populists. Change was change was in the air for sure. Jeremiah Simpson, also known as Sockless Jerry, a rancher from Medicine Lodge, was elected to the U.S. Congress. He accused his opponents of wearing silk socks, which was a metaphor as a symbol for wealth. If you were wealthy, you wore silk socks because they were worth a lot of money. This helped him get elected. A little bit of irony, though. Sockless Jerry became one of the best dressed congressmen, and he still kept his nickname. So he was wearing the silk socks that he gave everyone a hard time about. And Pefferism. The state legislature elected the U.S. senators, not the voters at this time. This eventually changes, but at this time in Kansas history, it's not going on. So the populists picked one of their own for the Senate, a man named William A. Peffer. He was a Kansas lawyer and a newspaper editor, and he became the first populist U.S. senator. He was such an important reformer that populism was sometimes called Pefferism. And in the election of 1892, the Kansas Democratic Party supported the populist candidates. So the populists had ideas that the Democrats supported. The People's Party took control of the state Senate and appeared to be taking control of the House of Representatives as well. So almost our entire state Senate or state legislature was controlled by the Populist Party. Mary Elizabeth Lease, another important Kansan at this time, was a writer, a lawyer, and a lecturer who came to Kansas in 1870 to teach school. She was a populist campaigner who said Wall Street owns the country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. So she wanted change. She was a supporter of the populists. She was the president of the Kansas State Board of Charities, but was removed because she was difficult to work with, supposedly. She was later reinstated for legal reasons. As the populists gained more and more control of the House of Representatives, a legislative war took place, not really with weapons and guns and cannons and all that, but kind of a struggle between the two parties. So back then, votes took a while to count. They were being hand counted, and the votes were still being counted when the 1893 legislature came together. Both the Populists and the Republicans claimed to have won the majority in the election. Both parties set up separate houses, they elected their officers, and they began work. The Populist governor declared the Populist House of declared the Populist House the official one, but the Republicans refused to leave. Lots of drama. So basically two political parties believe that they had won, believe that they had the control, and they're the ones who were in power. The Kansas Supreme Court had to decide on the issue, and they gave the majority to the Republicans because the Supreme Court, they favored the Republicans at the time. William Allen White, who we had talked about with the last lesson, the owner and editor of the Emporia Gazette, and he was a Republican as well. He wrote an editorial called What's the Matter with Kansas? He complained that Kansas had lost people, it lost money, and he stated that the Populist Party made Kansas look foolish to the nation, calling the populists gibbering idiots. It was represented in Republican newspapers, causing Democrats to pull support from the populists because the Democrats didn't want to look like gibbering idiots either, and it led to the downfall of the Populist Party. Later, William Allen White became more progressive, which progressive just meant that he was promoting or favoring ideas toward progress, toward better conditions, or new policies, ideas, and methods. He actually started believing in and following and pushing for some populist ideas. So, kind of some irony there, too. Socialism, which is a system where the people as a community or the government own all the major industries of a country, was another type of reform that was trying to get started here. The socialists believe that everyone should have access to the same amount of wealth. Now, here in our election, Bernie Sanders, people compare him to a socialist because he's wanting the government to provide a lot of things for the people of the United States. Back to Kansas. Appeal to Reason was a socialist newspaper published by Julius A. Wayland in Kansas City. Later, it was published in Girard, Kansas, our little corner of the state here, and it had a readership of over 500,000 people. Wayland had published another radical journal and started a utopian colony, basically an idealized or perfect place where everything was perfect. Comparing capitalism to socialism, capitalism is a kind of economic system we have here in the U.S. right now, but it's an economic system where the production of goods and services is owned by private citizens and not the government. It keeps government involvement to a minimum and very limited, and prices are determined by the supply and demand. Now, in a socialist economy, the government decides prices and wages, believing that the system should be fair to all. The government manages production and distribution, but technically the workers own the industries. So the socialist platform, things that they believed in, that they were trying to make happen in government. They proposed fair treatment of workers, basically shorter work days, safe working conditions, workman's comp, child labor laws, equal wages for women, things that eventually were passed in time. The government, they wanted the government to own railroads, canals, telegraph, telephones, all means of public transportation and communication. Didn't want people to have monopolies over those. They wanted to abolish government land grants. They wanted the legislation to prohibit waste of natural resources. The income taxes, they proposed that the income taxes, where the wealthy pay a larger percent of their earnings and the very poor were exempt, they didn't have to pay anything. They proposed free education to all kids. They proposed the establishment of government work program for the unemployed. They proposed election reform, the use of secret ballots, universal suffrage, where everybody, regardless of race or gender, got to vote, where people could initiate the laws and people can recall elected officials. That eventually got pushed through. And they wanted to totally discontinue the U.S. Senate. Big reason for that at the time was the state senates were the ones who were picking who were going to represent us in the U.S. senates. It was very corrupt, not real fair at the time. That's improved since the people have a say in who gets to represent us in the Senate now. Another famous Kansan, Kate Richards O'Hare. She was a very well-known socialist reformer. She spent a lot of her career writing and organizing for socialist causes. And she was the very first woman to run for the U.S. Senate. She didn't win, but she opened the door for women in the future. She was known for traveling the country to speak out against the U.S. fighting in World War I. She was eventually imprisoned for her anti-war activity, and President Coolidge pardoned her later. Little Blue Books. A couple named Emanuel and Marcette Haldeman Julius had been called the parent of the paperback book. They purchased what was called the Appeal to Reason newspaper and became publishers. They developed an inexpensive book series called the Little Blue Books to make literature affordable for all. They sold 5-cent copies from 1919 to 1951, and they published more than 6,000 titles. Entering the 20th century, the 1900s, Kansas was recovering from very difficult times, the Depression, all the reforms. Kansas was breaking out as a leader in agriculture, with more than half of the population working in farming. Farm products steadily increased in value. Kansas continued to grow in agriculture and industry. Big industry, uh, aircrafts became big in Kansas as well. Reforms continued to push for improvements in Kansas citizens' lives. It also pushed for reforms in the entire United States. And that brings chapter 6 to a close on reforms and all that. If you have questions, please reach out. I'll be talking to you all later. Have a great day.